Yo, what's up, everybody? This is Adam Hudson here of Real Sankara Hours, Pan-African socialist political podcast talking about news, current events, black culture, and all the stuff going on in the world from a Pan-African left-wing perspective. This is independent black media. Today's date is Sunday, June 29th, 2025. It's just me today, a solo episode. Peter, well, something happened to his computer. So, but also, like, Peter and I, we live in different parts of the country, so getting us to record together at the same time takes some planning ahead because we have our own jobs and different work schedules, and also lives. So getting us to record together takes some planning, but we're still going to record together. But to keep putting out more content more frequently, I'm going to be uploading and doing more solo episodes. I'm calling them Adam's Riffs. It's basically like kind of like a fireside chat style where just what I'm thinking about, but also obviously like some topics, like things I want to talk about. So it'll be a way it's like a way to keep putting out more episodes, even during times when Peter and I can't record together. So anyway, that's what this is. For today, what I want to talk about, a couple things. Juneteenth, the Zohran Mamdani, who won the primary mayoral election in New York City, and he beat Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo. So that was a major, like, it was a shock, and so some good news for the left. But and then also this will be related to Juneteenth, but like the generational divide within Black America and who we are as African Americans. So I'm gonna be talking about all that. There's a bunch of other stuff I want to talk about, but like I could easily go on and on and on and on and on. So there's other stuff I want to talk about, and I will segment that for another solo episode. So anyway, which also means like there'll be more episodes, more content put out. So yeah. Anyway, where to start? Well, let me start with Zohran Mamdani. I'll be honest, living here in California, I was paying attention to the election in New York City, but not that much, only tangentially. I didn't really expect much, to be honest, of like Mamdani to win. I'd heard about him. I was like, oh, okay, like another, obviously DSA guy. So I was like, I don't know, because the left is so used to losing. So, but I was also like, again, I live in California. I don't live in New York City. So, it was on my radar, but it wasn't like, I wasn't as invested in paying attention to it. I didn't really know what to expect. But so anyway, but yeah, so he beat Andrew Cuomo in the New York City mayoral primary. And so he's a Democratic Party nominee. So he's a member of the DSA, and he's in the Democratic Party. And yeah, he won. And just looking at his record, his parents, he's of Indian origin and Muslim, and his parents are Indian Muslim professors with, believe it, his father, Mahmoud Mamdani, is a very prominent Indian Muslim scholar with very anti-colonial politics, and then his mother, hold on, let me get her name right. I don't want to, hold on, because his family background. So, Zohran, his mother's last name is, I believe, is Nair. She's Mira Nair. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I knew her last name was Nair, but I wasn't sure first name. So yeah, Mira Nair. She's a filmmaker, and she's known actually for making the film Mississippi Masala. I'm looking at more of her background. The Monsoon Wedding. So Monsoon Wedding, The Namesake, Salam Bombay. So, anyway, yeah, his parents are like very well accomplished people. His father, yeah, is a professor. His mother's a very famous filmmaker. Um, Especially with the movie Mississippi Masala. I haven't heard it. I haven't seen it, but I know like for those of you who don't know, it stars Denzel Washington, and basically it's set in rural Mississippi, and it explores the interracial relationship between an African American man and an Indian American woman in rural Mississippi. So I haven't seen it, but I thought like the premise of the film is interesting. So I thought, it's interesting that Mira Nair, she's a director of that film. Came out in 1991, and Mira Nair is Zohran Mamdani's mother. So people are talking about his background, like some pretty, very interesting parents, and his own politics. Like he's pretty, lefty progressive, supported BDS, and he's proposing like a lot of I would say like social democrat style of policies, particularly like a rent freeze, because he was previously he was a member of the New York State Assembly representing Queens, the Queensboro in New York City. So he was elected to the New York State Assembly in 2020, and in 2025 he's running for. He won the Democratic primary to run for mayor of New York City, and he was actually born in Uganda. So his parents, Indian origin, living in Uganda, and there's like a diaspora of Indians who were kicked out of Uganda by Idi Amin. I don't know if his parents. I'm looking up. I want to get it right. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, his dad actually was expelled by Idi Amin. But I think like they moved around a lot. Anyway, I don't want to focus too much on that. But anyway, his background's interesting. So he won the primary. The left has been pretty jubilant about it. But again, this is a primary, so there's still a general election. So I'll be honest, like when I heard about his victory, the way, like particularly the online left and the left in general were talking about it, it made it seem like he was going to be the new mayor. And but now I think like some people are kind of calming down the hype a little bit. But yeah, he won the primary, but he's not going to be the mayor. So I mean, it's not confirmed yet. This is the primary. There's still the general election. So it remains to be seen, because he has to go up against Eric Adams, and I'll say like I think one of the things like hold on, let me look at my notes. Well, because there's a lot of like the people who don't like his win are the wealthy and the kind of like landowners, the corporatists, rich people. They don't like him, and obviously a lot of Zionists do not like him because of his stance on Israel-Palestine. And in one of the debates, he said, like when asked about like which foreign country he would go to, basically he was asked if he would visit Israel upon becoming mayor. He said no, he wouldn't visit Israel, which is like, yeah, like he's a fucking mayor of New York City. Why the fuck would you visit it? Like what's the point? It's like, so every mayor of every American city has to go visit like Israel. Like what the fuck? Anyway, but his win, I do think is a rebuke of the Zionist lobby, and I think it shows like how the pro-Israel propaganda, like, it's not working, because Israel is really losing the PR war because of just how openly violent and bloodthirsty that government is, and that what's going on in Gaza, and we're coming into the second year of Israel basically ethnically cleansing and doing what it wants to genocide Gaza to create this greater Israel, and then also attacking Iran as well, and Iran firing back. It's just Iran retaliating. So I think I think his win to me shows that like it is possible to like basically the pro-Israel PR machine has a crack in it, and that like is wearing off. I think so. I think that's what his win signifies, and I think it's worth building upon. So it's good. It's okay to have some optimism and hope, but I think it's important to still proceed with caution and strategy, because again, this is a primary. The general election is still coming up, and that's going to be a whole different beast. But there was like an intra-left debate about like the turnout, because they were showing like who had supported Mamdani, and the majority of black voters went for Cuomo. People are like, huh? What the fuck? And what was obvious, and someone else showed the data, that black millennials, so like black people around my age, I'm 37, so black millennials, basically younger black voters, were among Mamdani's biggest supporters, and that really shows, you know, the generational divide within black America, which I'll touch upon in a second. But before I do, I think one of the reasons why he won, just before, so I don't forget, I'll come back to that point. Like I said, this solo episode, the way I'm doing is more like me riffing fresh off the dome, yada yada. I think like Brad Lander, who is a city comptroller in New York City, who's he's a Jewish guy but pretty progressive. I think his endorsement of Mamdani was really important, because basically the Zionists were trying to paint Mamdani as like this scary Muslim who hates Jewish people, and Brad Lander's endorsement, I think, was really important. And I actually think that was a major boost, because Lander's supporters went to Mamdani, and I think it showed that you know, like Mamdani isn't this like scary brown guy who hates Jewish people. And also I think like Mamdani's appearance on the Colbert Show was important, and it was both Mamdani and Lander. So I think that actually was really important for his victory. So anyway, then getting back to black voters, right? Because among like, there's a debate on like the online left and kind of the left in general. Even some pundits were talking about, some like kind of lefty commentators were saying, what the fuck is up with black voters? Basically, because like in 2020, if you guys remember, and if you don't, you can go back to one of our earlier episodes back in 2020. Because in the 2020 election, during the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders was surging, and then the Democratic Party coalesced to basically just defeat Sanders and get behind Biden. And Jim Clyburn played a role in that in South Carolina by getting black voters to vote for fucking like Joe Biden, basically. And so like I've seen some non-black lefties, usually white lefties, being like, what the fuck, like older black voters keep voting for the wrong person. And I'm like, I just think it's silly because I mean, well, first of all, um, like if you spend some time in the left for a while, like I have, which is over a decade, um, like um, because it like before we started this podcast, I was a freelance journalist for a lot of progressive online outlets, but even before that, I was involved in a lot of activism, particularly anti-war activism, pro-Palestine activism, and like I've crossed circles with like different left-wing and socialist organizations. So like I'm pretty familiar with the left in general, particularly in the U.S. Um, and even like online left debates and et cetera, et cetera. So like so I've been in lefty spaces for a long time, and particularly with like I'll just say like the DSA slash Jacobin crowd, who more familiar with online, because like the DSA isn't as prominent here in the Bay Area. I think they're more prominent on the East Coast. I'm not sure. I'm not saying there's some good people in the DSA, but like they've had some issues, and one of those issues actually was tied to my point is reaching out to black people. And like I said, if you spend enough time in like left wing spaces writ large in general, a lot of white leftists, like when it comes to class solidarity, they're more likely to argue for trying to appeal to the disaffected white working class, even if they are reactionary. Basically, a lot of white leftists and non-black leftists in general still believe that reactionary white working class voters can be persuaded to essentially socialism or like any kind of social democrat left-wing policies, basically, as long as you appeal to their class interests. So, and look, there are a lot of reactionary white working class voters who vote for Trump. The majority of white people went for Trump. So, what I find interesting is okay, they hold out faith for white working class voters, but when it comes to older black voters whose politics are really kind of like more reflexively Democrat, just they just see them as like, oh my god, how the fuck can they be so stupid? That's what I find like so just just annoying and bizarre. Maybe not totally bizarre, because part of me gets it, like, okay, yeah, because look, there are a lot of white leftists who have let's say family members who are like reactionary, so they're going to identify with them more and hold out faith that like, okay, maybe we can like persuade them to our side. But when it comes to, again, older black voters who, I'll remind you, did not vote for Trump, and again, their politics are pretty much like, they watch a lot of MSNBC, they listen to Al Sharpton, and like there's this kind of trust and familiarity they have with mainstream Democratic politicians. And so I was like, okay, if you're going to say we should reach out to like white working class voters, even if they are reactionary, and bring them into like a left coalition, then like, okay, fine. Like if you're willing to do that, then like it shouldn't be that hard to reach out to older black voters who believe in the Democratic Party. Now, I'm obviously not endorsing their views, because like I have issues with the views of older black voters, and I've gotten in arguments, but like I still think they could be reached to. But I really think that younger black voters, basically black millennials and black Zoomers, are really the future of the black vote, if we're going to be honest. Because like the older black voters are getting older, and like a lot of boomers, they're dying. My late mother being an example, who passed away. Like, yeah, there are a lot of black people who are in their late 60s up into their 70s. Like, they're getting up there in age. they're not the future of the Democratic Party. And some of them, like, they don't pay attention to politics as deeply, especially as they get older. Like, they're just more just um a lot of them like just care more about retiring and living their life. They're not as focused on like the nitty gritty of politics. I mean, if they are political, it's more just them hating Trump, really. Which actually, that's a good segue into Juneteenth, because it's a little tie-in. Um, and before I get to that point, just to kind of put a pin in that, like to put a bow in what I was saying about Mamdani, um, millennials really showed out for Mamdani across all races: white millennials, Asian Latinos, black millennials. Millennials were among the highest supporters of Mamdani, which shows again there's a very real generational divide between younger black people and older black people when it comes to politics and how we see race and the realities of racism in the United States, which again ties into Juneteenth. So here's how I'll connect these two. Lately in recent years, I've been I mean, if you're a listener of this show, you probably know. But if you're new, or I'm not sure uh, if you're a new listener or not. But outside of this podcast, I am a musician. Um, I'm a drummer, percussionist, and I also a West African drummer. I do West African drumming. So I play an instrument called the djembe. It's a West African drum. Comes from West Africa. So I've been playing djembe for, oh my gosh, at this point almost a decade, about 9 years. But drums in general, which would include the drum kit, I've been playing that for 13 years. So drums in general, 13 years. My first instrument was playing piano when I was around 8, 9 years old. So, and I played piano for a couple years as a kid, and kind of moved away from it. Then got back into it in high school. Moved away from it, and then after I graduated college, I joined a band with two of my friends, and that's how I got into drums. So, anyway. When I was a kid, I was on and off with music, but then in my early 20s, when I really took music seriously and got into playing drums. So, so I played West African drumming, and I played at Juneteenth events. I played at a lot of different shows, but playing it at Juneteenth has become a little more routine. So, there's this place in Concord, California, near where I live, called Todos Santos Plaza, and that's where it's one of the local Juneteenth events. So I play there, and it's nice to see, like black people coming together, and I'm seeing more of a push among black Americans to congregate together, create our own spaces, and like the history of Juneteenth, which became a federal holiday pretty much after the George Floyd uprisings. So the way it's portrayed is, oh, we're celebrating Juneteenth because this is the day where slaves in Texas didn't know that they were free, and they were told that they were free. That is like barely scratching the surface, because on January 1st, 1863, so the Civil War began in 1861, and what led up to the Civil War was slavery. The South seceded the Confederacy over basically slavery, because as the U.S. was expanding westward, one of the biggest political debates was, okay, these newly admitted states, would they be slave states or free states? and there was some tension between the northern states, northern slave-free states, and the southern states. The South wanted more power and also to expand the system of slavery. So that was the debate, basically. Whereas the industrialized North didn't see a need for slavery. So that is what led up to the Civil War. That's why the South seceded from the Union. So the Union was fighting the Confederacy. So Civil War started in 1861. January 1st, 1863 is when the Emancipation Proclamation was declared by then President Abraham Lincoln, which basically freed the slaves in the Confederacy. But there are still issues particularly enforcement, because for another 2 years, the Confederacy was still fighting the Union, because they seceded from the Union, and they were like, oh, the Union can't tell us what to do. And so as the Civil War progressed, and part of the Union's victory, actually, because in the beginning of the Civil War, the Union was losing, but what turned the tide was the recruitment of black fugitive ex-slaves and recruiting them into the Union Army, because they definitely wanted to kill some fucking Confederates. So that turned the tide for the Union victory. And so as the Union Army progressed in the South, Texas was like a last holdout. And basically it was like an area where, there wasn't a lot of fighting in Texas, but so there were a lot of slave owners who basically went to Texas to basically keep their slaves and maintain slavery, especially as the Union Army progressed and was basically gaining more ground in the South. Then in April of 1865, the Confederate Army, led by then General Robert E. Lee, surrendered. But again, Texas was the last holdout, so you had to actually once slavery was abolished, the Confederacy surrendered, but there is an order put out by General Granger. Let me get the full name. General Gordon Granger. Is General Order number 3. So basically, June 19th is when the Union Army arrived in Galveston, Texas, and U.S. General Gordon Granger basically stood on Texas soil and read Order number 3, which said, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." So Texas was the last holdout. So basically, once the Union Army arrived in Texas and enforced the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation and essentially abolition, that is when slavery was over. That was on June 19th, 1865. So that is why it's celebrated within Black America as our Independence Day. And then keep in mind, in December of 1865 is when the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was signed into the U.S. Constitution and went into effect. So June 19th, 1865 basically marks the effective end of slavery, essentially, because there was the Emancipation Proclamation, but it didn't free all the slaves at that point because the South was still fighting, and Texas was the last holdout. So once the Union Army arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865, that was like the real, true, effective end of slavery. So that is really the Independence Day for African Americans. So that is why it's celebrated. So during the George Floyd uprising in 2020, in response to that, then President Joe Biden, he declared Juneteenth to be a federal holiday. Before that, it was a little more insular and celebrated within Black communities, kind of kept it to ourselves, but now it's a federal holiday, and so that means Americans get a day off on Juneteenth, but a lot of Americans don't know why it's a holiday and blah 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 blah. So I want to kind of put that out there, explain the context of Juneteenth, but um, that also raises a point about what I want to talk about with Black America's politics and Black American identity. So, um, and that'll be like the kind of the last topic of this riff. Um, because actually I played two shows for Juneteenth. There was one at Todos Santos Plaza and then another one in Oakland. Um, and to me, and I think among other Black people, like it shows this to me. It reminded me of the need for Black spaces, and I'm seeing more of them grow in the Bay Area. And I think um, obviously I want to see it throughout the country as well. Because I think there's a need for Black spaces for Black people to socialize for arts and culture and even politics. Um, so let me actually like explain who African Americans, Black Americans are as a people, and then what I'll also do is this is a free episode by the way, so I'll touch base with what I said in a bonus episode sometime last year, which I actually think is good for reiterating in a free episode, particularly in light of Mamdani's primary win and just Black American politics in general, particularly the generational divide. So, uh, like there is this interesting article I read earlier today. Let me pop it up. This will be a good article to read, and then I'll talk about who we are as a people. So, this was an opinion piece in The Root. The title is How Black Americans Are Raising a Generation of Kids Who Don't Understand Blackness. Um, we failed one generation. We failed one generation of Black kids, and we must ensure we don't drop the ball on another. This is by Lawrence Ware, published 2 days ago. I'll just read the whole thing. It's not that long. Uh, yeah, it's really not that long. It's fairly short. Okay. Um, there is a tragedy happening in the Black community, like watching a car crash in slow motion. This generation of Black kids never understand nor appreciate what it means to be Black, and it didn't just happen overnight. A quick history lesson to show us how we got here. Uh, the Great Migration occurred from 1910 to 1970. During that time, more than 6 million Black people from the South moved north with the hope that they would encounter less racism and more job opportunities in the Northeast, Midwest, and Western parts of the United States. They found that racism in places like Chicago and Los Angeles was just as bad as in the South. It just manifested more often in redlining and microaggressions more than the overt, blatant anti-blackness they were accustomed to below the Mason-Dixon line. As a result, thriving Black communities were formed in the cities. These refuges of American racism escaped to. As a result, many of us found economic success, which is a good thing, mostly. We moved out of the Black communities we had formed and started moving to the suburbs. This is true, and I'll stop here. Like, I've even noticed it in the Bay Area because, the Black communities in the Bay Area that were like definitely formed as a result of the Great Migration. Richmond and Oakland are two of the biggest ones. There's also smaller towns like Vallejo and Pittsburgh where you actually like those cities are just very racially and ethnically diverse, but they actually have a black community. In Pittsburgh here, there's an actual Black community that's at this point a couple generations. It's same for the other communities in Pittsburgh in general. Like there's like Latinos and Asians in Pittsburgh who've been here for a couple generations, and that makes up the character of Pittsburgh as a city, which is, in light of all the ICE shit deportations that's going on, that's one thing I like about this community, because at least like the mayor and the people who run the city, the political establishment in local political establishment, they're like at least putting up a fight which is a good thing. So that makes me kind of glad to live here. But in like some of the more really white flight areas of the Bay Area, there are more black people moving in. Particularly further east to like Antioch, Brentwood, Oakley, because for cheaper housing, and two, the houses are bigger, and basically they're suburbs, and it's they're black people moving from like, the hood and wanting to live there for a better quality of life, which makes sense. But also it's led to what I've noticed is led to is what this article is talking about, is that the black kids who do grow up in those suburbs, like they often face an identity crisis, which is kind of sad. So I'll continue with the article. And started moving to the suburbs. Our houses got bigger and our cars more expensive. Because of where we now lived, our kids started attending predominantly white schools. We thought we'd made it. Then we saw that there was an underside to this success. I don't even know if it, like you say, it's success. It's more just like, at least in the Bay Area, it's just black people moving to suburbs that have like cheaper housing, and also a way to escape the extreme poverty and violence in the hood. So compared to living in that environment, yeah, it's like that quality of life is an upgrade. But the motivation behind it is I wanted to mention the motivation behind it, because there are a lot of black people who they just want bigger homes and stuff like that, and again, they don't want to live in the hood. So but yeah, Brentwood and Oakley, like, they're still predominantly white, and there are more Latinos. Anyway, it started. Okay, so article continues. It started small. One or two of the black kids raised in the suburbs would show up to a family reunion not knowing how to play spades or dominoes. Maybe they would ask that Taylor Swift is played at the cookout instead of Stevie Wonder or Marvin Gaye. Not a big deal if that was the extent of it. But it did not stop there. It got worse. There are many black kids who feel more comfortable around white kids than they do their own people. There have been copious amounts of research to support this. We once joked that it was black athletes who dated and married white girls. That has now shifted. No longer is it only a star basketball player here and there. Many black boys who do not want to befriend, let alone date, black girls. And that should not be surprising. The more successful a black man is, the more likely he is to date and marry a white woman. Yeah, that's true. The black men who do make over 100K, like, they still prefer black women. And also because one thing that annoys me about the dating out and stuff like that, it's always it's always like the finger pointing is always like the black man dating the white woman because he just thirsty for white women, blah 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 blah. And it's like, well, I've seen more black women date white men, especially as they go into white collar professions. Like there, I hate to say it, there are some black women who don't want to date black men. It's not being a hater to say that, but I just want to say that because definitely in my personal experience, I've seen it both. I've come across many black women who've dated white men, and some have married them and later got divorced. But but I do think it's a result that it is, if you're in more integrated spaces and you're around a lot more white people as a black person, the chances of you dating a white person are going to increase. So I think a part of it has to do with just a huge part of it has to do with just if you're surrounded by a lot of white people and you grow up around white people, especially starting at a young age, right? If your formative experiences were growing up around white people, right? No matter if you're a black man or a black woman, the chances of you dating and marrying white are gonna go up. So yeah. Anyway, I just want to say that because it's, again, always in the interracial dating, it's always just focusing on like black men who date out, and it's like, well, okay, like I've definitely seen it the other way. Like, and by the way, especially for interracial dating, the most common pairing, from what I remember, I have to find the numbers on this. I believe one of the most common pairings is a Latina woman and a white guy, and I think like Asian woman and white guy, that's up there as well. So, but for the most part, like the majority of black people still marry black, especially when it comes to marriage. Even when you like, I mean, compared to black women, yeah, I think black men tend to like the interracial marriage rate like is higher for black men, but the majority of black men still marry black women, even if they are successful. But I do think a lot of it has to do with, yeah, as you quote unquote move up and you're in more integrated spaces, and if you're just around a lot more white people, the chances of you marrying white are going to increase. So anyway, which kind of, it ties into this article, like, yeah, like black kids who move to the suburbs, and if it's predominantly white, like, yeah, they're gonna date and marry, they're gonna date a lot of white people, you know. I think the same applies to, like, I think like black women who tend to date and marry white guys. A lot of them had a similar upbringing. They probably were one of the few black students growing up and like were surrounded by white people, and so like, yeah, they're like go for a lot of white guys, you know. So article continues. This also influences the way young black kids that were raised around mostly white people vote as well. Pew Research reports that 7% of black voters over 50 currently identify as or lean conservative, a relatively small amount. But 17% of black voters align with the Republican Party, and much of that has to do with where they were raised. And yes, many of them voted for the man who is currently in the White House. Yeah, there is a shift toward Trump. I will say, like, when people talk about black voters shifting for Trump, I think part of that has to do with the Obama effect wearing off. Because another thing you have to consider is there is now a generation of younger black voters who are of voting age who they were incredibly young when Obama first got elected. Like, let me put it this way. So take a young black voter who is 20 years old, right? That means they were born in 2005. They were 3 years old when Obama got elected, and when Trump got elected, they were 11, right? So their understanding of like what it means to have a black president is different because, like, again, they were incredibly young when Obama first got elected. So, and the way they perceive Trump, and it's similar with like young people in general across race, like their understanding of like the Obama presidency and the Trump presidency, particularly the first one, is different because, yeah, for a lot of them, they were young kids. They were in fucking middle school when Trump was during his first term, right? So they were at that point, they were too young to process like how awful Trump was. Like, Trump was normal to them, basically. So I think that's part of it. Like, yes, definitely where they were raised, but also like just which I'll touch upon when I talk about the generational divide. The way they've grown up just in this time period is very different. So I think like a lot that it's not that like Trump had like some magic sauce that like was able to attract younger black voters. I think a lot of it has to do with just the Obama effect wearing off. Now, when it gets to the numbers for black people who lean conservative has typically been around 20%. So I would say, just from a statistical standpoint, like, we're getting back to like the norm. But it's just like my point is that like there's always been around like around 20% of black people who have conservative beliefs. Like, okay, I'll give some examples. Professors John McWhorter and Glenn Loury, two examples of black conservatives. Condoleezza Rice, another black conservative, right? There've always there's a General Colin Powell, except like Colin Powell, like I think a lot of his conservatism stems from him being a general. And by the way, he was also he's black but of Jamaican origin. Which I bring it up because in the context of what I'm gonna explain with African American identity. But like, okay, like Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, Condoleezza Rice. There's always been like a small number of black conservatives who, even with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, I think with John McWhorter, he's somewhat been taken seriously by the black community, but like he's more like kind of like a black independent / conservative. He's someone who doesn't like toe the typical like black Democratic Party liberal line. But he's not like all the way leaning Republican, but he has some conservative views. Same with Glenn Lowry, who he just got fired from the Manhattan Institute because he was criticizing Israel. So but my point is that like there's always been a cohort of a small percentage of black conservatives. I think what it means to be a black conservative now is that like the black Trump supporters who are ardently like pro MAGA, like in order for them to embrace the Trump coalition and the Trump movement, they have to be like so militantly self-hating and anti-black. But like those types of people within the black community, they're always like looked at as like, you're just a fucking idiot. Like they're those types of black people are pretty much like ostracized within the black community. I think there are plenty of black people who have like conservative-ish beliefs on certain social issues, but they're not like MAGA or like a registered Republican. But anyway, my point is that like numerically, there's always the black conservative, black Republican vote has always hovered somewhere around like 20%. So people, I don't like, I just don't buy the idea that like this sort of alarmism that like Trump increased his black support. Like, yeah, like a little bit, but it wasn't that significant. And also like there's always been like 20% of black conservatives. So I think we're returning back to like the norm, the statistical norm of like black conservative. It's just like their relationship to the conservative movement, I think, is probably just a little bit different. So, but again, I do think it another part of it is just the Obama effect wearing off, because for younger black voters, especially if they're Gen Z, because there's really like, I think that uptick of black voters under 50 had to do with like Gen Z, because there is a rising conservatism among Gen Z. Black millennials and millennials in general are pretty much like solidly like left of center for the most part. So I think that uptick in black voters under 50 aligning with the Republican Party has to do with like Gen Z overall becoming relatively more conservative. There's still plenty of Zoomers who are like leftists, but there is a rising like conservative movement among Zoomers. So anyway, I'll continue with this article. So I don't want to go on for too long. So this article is almost done. So to continue with the article, let me just get personal for a second. This is the article. I help lead the Center for Africana Studies at my university, and year after year I see black kids walking into my classroom who do not know black history. They cannot tell you anything about our culture, and they are shocked to learn that there are black Greek letter organizations. Black parents who raise their kids this way now see that there is a problem. Many are desperately trying to talk to their kids about black culture. Some turn to organizations like Jack and Jill of America Incorporated as they try to reconnect their kids to the black experience. But I think the damage is largely done. We have come to terms with the reality that there will be a generation of black people who are largely disconnected from the black experience. We must learn from our mistakes and do better. Okay, that's a good. I think it's a good article to tie into my point that I want to raise in this solo episode. So, Let me just like start off by explaining who we are as black people, and especially as black Americans. So black people, people of African descent, covers the African diaspora and people on the African continent, right? Um Again, this is a Pan-African political podcast, so we're coming from like a Pan-African perspective. And for those of you who aren't sure what Pan-Africanism is, I'll just give like a brief description of what Pan-Africanism is as a philosophy. It's basically a philosophy that emphasizes the shared history and connection between all people of African descent. Basically, Pan-Africanism as a philosophy, it emphasizes building bonds and solidarity among all people of African descent around the world, and it particularly emphasizes the shared history of people of African descent. You can get into like, the diverse cultures of people of African descent, but basically as a Pan-Africanist, the way I view it, it's not just the shared history, but also like we have shared political interests. A lot of our experiences as black people, people of African descent, no matter where we are pretty similar, because anti-blackness as a form of oppression is pretty global, right? And it manifests itself in different ways, but for the most part, it's pretty similar, like no matter where you go as a black person, right? So to combat global anti-blackness, like, let me put it this way. If the disease is global anti-blackness, Pan-Africanism is the cure, right? So, like, Pan-Africanism is the vaccine for the virus that is global anti-black racism. And again, Pan-Africanism as a philosophy it emphasizes the shared experiences and history of people of African descent on the continent and around the world, and particularly like the events that shaped two major events that shaped people of African descent. The first one, the major one, is the transatlantic slave trade and the trafficking of 2.5 to 12 million African people from their homelands in Western Central Africa to slave plantations in the Americas, from North America to Central America, the Caribbean, and South America, right? And as a result, you have like millions of people of African descent living outside of Africa because our ancestors were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Within the United States, there's somewhere like 40 million black Americans. Some are, and this population is growing, some are black people whose ancestors were recent black immigrants, but then most of them are people like myself whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. So that's what it means to be black, right? Blackness as an identity is global. It's not just confined to the United States. Now, what does it mean to be African American, right? African American, excuse me, that term, that identity, actually started in the 1700s. It didn't start with Jesse Jackson. People get that wrong. The first use of the term African American was during the American Revolution. Basically announcing that we are people of African descent in the United States. Because during the American Revolution, what it meant to be American, like, it had to be defined, right? And look, at that time, like, if you were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you were like the true American, right? Enslaved African people and Native Americans, they were not included. Like, that wasn't the goal of the white settlers in North America. So, but also at the time, like, look, the African people in North America had a very different experience. They were slaves. They were enslaved people. They obviously had a different lineage than the Europeans. So they looked different. They had different also different culture, you know. The genesis of African American culture stems from the dozens of African ethnic groups who formed a new identity in North America, and they were able to retain some elements of their culture despite the condition of slavery. Their names were taken away, their language was taken away, and that made it very difficult to establish some direct continuity to the culture of their homeland. So there's a lot of stuff we lost. It's true, but and also families were separated. So like, you had slaves who were from different ethnic groups, and their families were broken apart. So like, they were on plantations with African people of other ethnic groups, right? So one thing I'm really kind of like I'm nerding out a lot more, and I'm just really intrigued, especially as a musician who plays West African drumming. Like, I'm really intrigued with the life of enslaved African people on the plantation, and like what their day-to-day routine was like, and what their life was like. Because I think like the way we talk about slavery is that, enslaved Africans were just like these sort of like faceless, nameless sort of robots who were just all that happened was them just getting the shit beat out of them. Like, they had a life. And so African Americans. So basically, the term African American started in the late 1700s, American Revolution, and that was basically saying that like, it was on a pamphlet basically encouraging Black people to support the revolution, to support the fight for independence against the British, and that's where the use of the term came from. But even then, during that time, right, by the 1776, enslaved African Americans that had been in the United States at that point for around 100 years. So even by then, they were already kind of like becoming like a new sort of people in a way. And definitely they were definitely different than the Europeans. Again, not only were they of African descent, but their experience was that of slavery. Like slavery brought together people of different ethnic groups and then like reduced them to slaves. So the African population in North America at that time, like, they had that shared experience that they did not share with the white people. The white people were the slave masters. So the experience was totally different. So hence why, like, yeah, there's that distinction. And again, despite the condition of slavery, African people had like their own way of life, culture, and customs that they were able to preserve from Africa on the plantations. So that's who African Americans are. We are the descendants of African people from Western Central Africa who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade and who were enslaved in the U.S. That's what it means to be African American. So that's different than someone who's, let's say, like Afro-Cuban or Jamaican or Haitian, right? Now, in their cases, their ancestors were also enslaved, but they were enslaved in a different part of the Americas, and similar to African Americans, they were able to preserve elements of their African culture but in a different territory and different context, right? So, as a result, their culture is slightly different than African Americans, right? But what binds African Americans, Jamaicans, Haitians, Afro-Cubans together is that, like, our ancestors were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. The only difference is where the slave ship dropped our ancestors off, right? So, that is who African Americans are as a people. And to tie to what it means to be an ethnic group, which is what I was saying, digging into in like the solo episode I recorded a couple months to a year ago, is that, to be an ethnic group, you need a shared ancestry, shared history, shared language or dialect, and shared culture and customs, right? African Americans, we have all that. We have a shared ancestry. We are primarily of African ancestry. that's the majority of our bloodline. Now, yes, there's some like Native American, European American ancestry thrown in there, but it varies from person to person. I think people get a little bit too hung up on like the quote unquote admixture of African Americans. We're majority African lineage. That's the main point. Um, like there may be some other stuff thrown in there because of obviously slavery and yes, during slavery, like a lot of white slave owners had non-consensual sexual relations with their enslaved women, and as a result had mixed race children. But those mixed race children were still considered to be slaves. So hence why so there are people who are biracial African Americans who are part of the Black American experience because of that, right? Now, there's the issue of like, yes, there are some biracial people who wind up passing for white. That's a whole different story. But for the most part, like African Americans as a population, we are a majority African lineage. Like my family tree is majority Black. When you go further down the line, I think with the case with most African Americans, when you go down like a couple generations, like past great grandparents, you'll find like a white person here or there, right? That's what it's like for my family tree. But in my case, like I don't have white grandparents. Let's just say that. I don't even have like white great grandparents. The white people, like it's further down the line with me. So it's like, but family reunions, pictures, like my family tree is Black. It's a tree of Blackness. So, and I think that's the case for a lot of African Americans. Like we're mostly of Black African descent. So anyway, so we have that shared ancestry. But we are like almost a new type of African in the sense that we are an amalgamation of a bunch of different African ethnic groups who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. So we're not like, let's say, purely Yoruba or Igbo or Ashanti or Fulani. Like we're a mix of all the different ethnic groups of Western and Central Africa. That's who we are, lineage-wise, right? And again, like when those people were enslaved in the Americas, they found like other ways of preserving their culture among each other, and as a result, we created like a new identity, a new culture. So there's that, and then obviously the shared history, slavery, transatlantic slave trade, U.S. chattel slavery. We do have our own dialect of English, African American vernacular English. People think it's just slang or quote unquote ghetto talk, but it's African American vernacular English. I sometimes like to think of it as Black American English. And we have we have our own culture. Juneteenth is one of our, well, now it's a federal holiday, but it's originally like practiced among Black Americans. As a musician, I'll say like when it comes to culture and our music, one of my uncles who's a musician, I always say what he told me because the way he put it was like a great way to remember it. He told me to study blues and jazz because that's the mother and the father. R&B and rock and roll is the son and the daughter. So when you look at African American music, technically blues is older than jazz, but I would say like it still applies in that like they both laid a crucial foundation for Black American music. But if you look at the African American music, particularly post slavery, there's blues, jazz. Well, there's blues, then there's ragtime, and then in New Orleans, during slavery, there was Congo Square, where enslaved African people were able to preserve their African drumming. Drums were banned throughout most of North America after the Stono Rebellion because they thought like they were using drums for war and shit like that. So music got preserved in other ways on the plantation, particularly through the banjo. The banjo is a West African instrument. So that's how African music got preserved, was through string instruments, and particularly the banjo, which is a West African instrument. It comes from West Africa. So like, and that's where you get like the blues music, and blues music goes back to West Africa. To put it in layman's terms, so like the notes that give like a blues sound, those come from West Africa. They don't come from like a Western scale, because there's these notes, they're called blue notes, but it's usually on like the flat third, fifth, or seventh note, because the blues is usually pentatonic 5-note scale. Sometimes it's 7-note scale. But like they're just kind of like bent notes that give it like blues a sort of like twangy, bluesy sound, and it's often played sort of repetitively, is syncopated. So that all comes from like West African musical forms, notes, and all that stuff. So musically, blues doesn't come from European music. It doesn't come from it. So anyway, so that's how it got preserved during slavery. Then after slavery's abolished, and so like again, like Congo Square, like that's where, because it was Congo Square in New Orleans, because it used to be a French colony, and then the United States got Louisiana after Louisiana Purchase. But when it was colonized by France, they had like a specific like a local ordinance that allowed like enslaved African people to like basically because they were Catholic, they didn't believe, the French were Catholic, so they didn't believe in like working on Sundays. So like they gave slaves a day off on Sundays, and so every Sunday enslaved Africans were only given one spot to openly practice their drum and dance tradition. So that was Congo Square. So anyway, then after the Civil War, so you get like, okay, the banjo, and then the ragtime, and then New Orleans, the New Orleans marching bands, and they were able to the lot of African musicality from Congo Square. You get that in like New Orleans marching bands, and then you merge like blues, ragtime, and New Orleans marching bands merge all that together. That's when you get jazz music. Okay, so you have blues and jazz. Then after blues and jazz, Great Migration. Around the 1940s, post World War II, you get R&B music, rhythm and blues. So basically blues music, but a little more sped up. You can dance to it. So you get R&B music, and then rock and roll. And then after the 70s, you get like late 60s, early 70s, you get funk music, and then hip hop music with the creative use of sampling and DJs. They were sampling a lot of like funk records, funk and soul records, and so that is how you get hip hop. So anyway, I'm really condensing a lot of history there, but my point is like that's who African Americans are as a people, right? And that is our culture. That's where we come from. And a lot of African American culture, a lot of people mimic it, so it becomes like the let's say the arbiter of like what it means to be cool. So popular culture. So American popular music is based off of African American music. So anyway, I can go on and on. I could even have like a longer riff where I go more in depth. That's just a summary, but that is who we are as African Americans. And so so how does it tie into, okay, this article and the generational divide, and even with the Mamdani primary, right? Because there was definitely a difference in voting patterns between young black voters and older black voters, right? And then like there's now a younger generation of black kids who don't understand their history that well. Okay, so what happened? Like what the fuck happened, right? So again, there's a bonus episode where I kind of went into it, but like I want to touch upon it again and sort of like bring it up again. So with older black voters who are like boomers, right? There's boomers, and there's silent generation, and there's the greatest generation, right? So the greatest generation, let me get my years right and shit, all that fun stuff. Greatest generation. Okay. The greatest generation. They're the demographic cohort from people born from 1901 to 1927. before the greatest generation was, oh, the lost generation. Okay. So the lost generation are people born from 1883 to 1900. Okay, so those are people who are coming of age at really like the turn of the century, the turn of the from the 19th to the 20th century. Okay. The greatest generation, that's like the GI World War II generation. They're born from 1901 to 1927. Okay, so my late grandparents, my late grandmother was alive for much of my formative years, and I knew her, so and we always got to see her. She was born in, I believe, 1925. Yeah, she was born in 1925. And her husband, my late grandfather, who I don't remember because he died the same year I was born, he was born in 1924, I believe. So they were from the greatest generation. Silent generation, those are people born between, from 1928 to 1945. And then the boomers, who everybody loves to hate for a lot of legitimate reasons, that is a generation born from 1946 to 1964. Because there was a major baby boom in the mid 20th century. It was following the end of World War II. So there are a lot of babies being born during that time period. Hence the term boomer, baby boom. So my late mother, who was born in 1953, she was a baby boomer. And my father, who's still alive, born in 1958, he's also a baby boomer. But my father was born a little bit toward the tail end of boomer. So like he's definitely a baby boomer, but like there's like a type of boomer who were like born at the tail end of boomer who kind of have like some Gen X sensibilities. In Generation X, that is people born from like 1965 to 1980. I've heard it from like 1964 to 1980 or something like that. You get like different markers for it for these types of generations. Hold on, let me. Sorry, I was leaning a bit. Hold on. All right, yeah. Millennials. I'm just kind of going through. Okay, so millennials. Here we go. Millennials are people born from 1981 to 1996. So the youngest millennials are 29, and the oldest millennials are 44. I was born in 88, so I'm 37. So I'm smack dab in the middle of millennial. Generation Z, they're born, that's people born from 1997 to 2012. And Generation Z, they are getting older because the oldest Zoomers are close to 30. Haha. Get used to it, Zoomers. You're not going to be the cute young people anymore. But the youngest Generation Z are born in 2012, so that means 13. So the youngest Zoomers are in 8th grade, and the oldest Zoomers are 28. Okay, so Zoomers are still young people, but the generation that people like, the generation of kids in K through 12 right now, is fucking Generation Alpha. And they were the ones who were like really took the hit of like COVID and shit. And so did Gen Z, but like anyway. So I want to give that generational breakdown. So okay. So with that generational breakdown, okay. So let's go to like greatest generation, silent generation, right? Because I think most of the greatest generation have already passed away, and then silent generation, they're old. They're I think probably the oldest ones alive around there. So anyway, the silent generation are starting to die off, and then so are some of the boomers. So the greatest generation and silent generation, um, they they grew up during a time of racial segregation. So when you look at the civil rights movement, right, all the leaders, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, um, they were around like I would say like the cusp of Greatest Generation and Silent Generation. Malcolm X was born, yeah, he was born in 1925. I remember, yeah, because he would have been 100 years old had he lived. He was of the Greatest Generation, the GI generation, even though he didn't serve in the military. Uh, Martin Luther King was born in 1929, so Martin Luther King was Silent Generation. So if you look at like a lot of those major civil rights leaders, a lot of them are like, yeah, from the Greatest Generation and Silent Generation around that time period. Um, I often like to bring up Adam Clayton Powell. Adam Clayton Powell was, oh well, okay, he's before the Greatest Generation. He's from, because he was born in 1908. So, um, so he was born in 1908. That means he was born not the Lost Generation. Um, Wait a minute. I'm sorry. Yeah, he was part of the Greatest Generation. My bad. Because Greatest Generation that starts in 1901. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of the major civil rights leaders were of the Greatest Generation, right? And they lived during Jim Crow racism, and a lot of them were putting up the fight, putting a fight up to it, putting a fight against it, right? Putting up a fight. Um, the the ones who were like the youth of the time, like doing the lunch counter sit-ins and like the protests on campuses, those were the boomers. Okay, so the baby boomers, again, they were born 1946 and 1964. Um, a lot of the ones sitting at the lunch counters, I think they were probably like maybe tail end of Silent Generation, but definitely around the baby boomers, right? Um, and then the kids protesting on campuses against the Vietnam War and for other you know, social and cultural issues, like when it came to let's say like ethnic studies, feminism, race, etc., etc. Those are the boomers, right? So the boomers were in college during like those when they were protesting on campus against like the Vietnam War and other issues going on in the world, right? Um, the whole like hippie movement that really came on the heels of the civil rights movement. So there's a civil rights movement that protested um, legalized racial segregation. You had the civil rights movement. Then you had the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. Then you had the feminist movement, and we're at the end of Pride Month, so like the LGBTQ movement, right? So that all that stuff was going on, and a lot of that like kind of social emancipation happening during that time, like a lot of it was on the heels of the civil rights movement. Okay, and that the young people at the time protesting on campuses were the baby boomers, and when it came to like their politics and what shaped them, it was the civil rights movement fighting against legalized racism and protesting against the Vietnam War. Okay, that is what shaped the baby boomers. And when it comes to black people who are baby boomers, like my late mother, that's what shaped them. My late mother, she was born in 1953. So she actually lived during segregation. So this shows like how like this history is not that, it's not ancient history. Like I I myself am only one generation removed from Jim Crow because my mother lived through it, right? I mean, she was young when it happened, but and she lived in Detroit, Michigan at the time, which wasn't part of the Jim Crow South. But I remember her telling me that like even in Detroit, Michigan, there were still like forms of segregation on like a cultural level, right? Um, uh, and the patches of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. My mom was yeah, she was 11 during that time. So she was like fourth, fifth grade around there. Um, And then Voting Rights Act in 1965. Yeah, she would have been like around middle school at the time. So, 1950, 1964. Oh, my mom would have been, yeah, she would have been like probably tail end of fourth grade going into fifth grade. And then Voting Rights Act, she would have been like around middle school during that time. So my mom lived during segregation. And by the way, Brown v. Board of Education, that decision was, let me get the year. It was like 1950. Oh, 1954. I was going to say 1955. It was 1954 when that decision came. Yeah, my mom was like a year old. So Brown v. Board of Education, that basically established that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. So, yeah, that decision was decided. Oh, May 17th, 1964. Yeah, my mom was barely a year old when that happened. Okay, so, yeah, so that's what shaped the politics of the boomers, right? So at that time, the Democratic Party, okay, is where we get into the voting patterns and all that type of stuff. The Democratic Party, that is when, like, it really started with Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He started getting, basically reshaping the Democratic Party as a party of the working class, and started to embrace some elements of, like, the nascent civil rights agenda. Civil rights hadn't really, like, kicked off up until like the 50s, but there are inklings of it happening like around the the 30s and 40s, right? So especially with his like the New Deal programs, I mean, there are elements that did hurt it, like Black Americans didn't benefit to the full extent of the New Deal programs, but starting with Roosevelt, then with Kennedy, and finally with Johnson, the Democratic Party started to bring Black Americans into the Democratic Party's coalition with certain policies, particularly when it came to embracing and supporting desegregation and certain, economic policies, right? And it was really with Johnson, because he was the one who signed into law the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. That's really like when Black America became wedded to the Democratic Party, because, look, the Democratic Party did deliver. I mean, the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed racial segregation, that was huge. It's a major piece of legislation that, especially if you're a person of color and you're a millennial, like, a lot of our experiences when it comes to race and multiculturalism, that wouldn't have happened without the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? And that was a huge piece of legislation, and it was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a Democrat. And so the Democratic Party basically became the party of civil rights in the eyes of Black Americans, okay? And as a result, that is why a lot of older Black voters vote for the Democratic Party. Because during that time, the Democratic Party did deliver on something fucking important, like the Civil Rights Act. Now, things changed. The Democratic Party, and not even just like it was also labor unions as well. They were part of the Democratic Party coalition as well, right? But over time, the Democratic Party moved away from it, embraced neoliberalism, deregulation of the free market, supporting the rolling back of certain regulations of the free market. Clinton, he signed laws like that, repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, which established that firewall between commercial banking and investment banking, and the deregulation of derivatives trading on Wall Street. And his actions basically led up to the 2008, the bursting of the housing bubble in 2007, and then the 2008 financial crash, right? I could explain that in like another episode. But over time, the Democratic Party moved away from its original base, which were, it being the party of labor unions and civil rights. Um, and then, and obviously, former President Joe Biden, he signed into law the 1994 crime bill. Um, and a lot of Democratic Party politicians, along with Republican politicians, um, they supported the expansion of mass incarceration, which predominantly targeted black people. So, um, so now that I've contextualized all that, the reason why, again, a lot of older black voters just reflexively vote Democrat is because of that. The Democratic Party did deliver, and over time, the Democratic Party machine has, like, established some good relationships with parts of the black political machine. So a lot of, like, black politics today, so much of it is wedded to the Democratic Party, especially in the form of get out the vote, essentially, like getting black people to come out to vote, and black people typically, like, vote for the Democratic Party, right? So there's this tight relationship between black politics and the Democratic Party. And the apotheosis of that, because again, I think, like, with that kind of old black civil rights politics, like, from their perspective, the solution to racism was basically getting more black people in high places, protecting affirmative action, protecting the gains of the civil rights movement, and the apotheosis of that was the election of President Barack Obama for 2 terms. He is essentially the end point of integration and civil rights. He's the end point of that, getting a black president. And one thing I often say is that, especially coming from my experience as a freelance reporter, writing about Guantanamo, police terrorism, and gentrification, the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests happened under Obama's watch. Particularly the protests after the police killing of Michael Brown in St. Louis. Like, that happened during Obama's second term in 2014. And to me, it always raises the question, like, what does it mean to have a black president when black people are still being killed by police officers? So what that shows to me is that the realities of racism that black millennials and black Zoomers have to deal with are different than what black baby boomers had to deal with. And black Gen Xers, they were, like, the first ones to benefit from integration, because they were the first generation born after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Because again, Gen X starts like 1965. That's like when, again, the Civil Rights Act was passed. So they were the first generation to not live through Jim Crow racism. And a lot of what black Gen Xers had to go through, like, they were the ones who got hit hard by the crack epidemic and mass incarceration. What black millennials and black Zoomers, like, what we're dealing with are different forms of systemic anti-black racism in the context where you don't have legalized racial discrimination. Again, black Gen Xers, black millennials, and black Zoomers are dealing with forms of racism that do not occur in the form of legalized racial segregation. We're dealing with other forms of it. So the way that shapes how we view race in politics. So as a result, black millennials, like, especially millennials as a generation, millennials were like, the hope and change, like, with Obama, but then a lot of millennials now are a lot more jaded, and there are more millennials who, my politics were always, like, pretty left, but I've noticed some millennials who, during the Obama years, were very much supportive of Obama, but now, um, as some time have passed, have become much more critical of his legacy. And especially, like, I've noticed with more black people have started to reassess Obama's legacy, because he didn't do anything. He didn't deliver anything for the black community, because we're still dealing with a lot of real issues, despite having a black president. So, especially when it comes to housing, gentrification, the massive racial wealth gap, police brutality, wages, jobs. Like, we're dealing with other forms that, like, the compounding effect of coming from a people who've went through 250 years of slavery and another 100 years of racial apartheid. The compounding effect is being in a position where, like, as a community, like, we don't have, like, a level of intergenerational wealth. That's one of the biggest issues that Black America is facing. And then also, like, on a cultural level, there's we want to hang on to certain things about who we are, and our culture as African Americans has been so gentrified that I like Black Americans, like, we're much more welcoming when it comes to our culture than other groups of people. Like, other groups of people, like, they gatekeep certain things. When it comes to especially how they do business and their own culture and customs, and we're much more welcoming, and I would say in many ways it's to our detriment. A lot of people copy and mimic our culture, so there's cultural appropriation is a very real thing, and so we're dealing. African Americans are dealing with a different set of issues, and I think that as a result, I think that's why a lot of Black millennials and many Black Zoomers, our politics are more left wing, because we've seen that just voting for the Democratic Party isn't enough. Meanwhile, compared to our boomer elders, again, they're coming from a different perspective. They're much more wedded to the Democratic Party because they did deliver during their formative years. But if I was to talk to a Black baby boomer who, like, is still wedded to the Democratic Party, I would tell them, like, I would start off with that the Democratic Party that they remember from their formative years is very different from the Democratic Party of today. So that's why I think there's, like, this level of familiarity and trust that older Black voters have with the Democratic Party, whereas, like, with younger Black voters, our politics are different because, again, we're dealing with a very different set of material circumstances as it relates to race, systemic racism, and anti-Blackness that the baby boomers, their reality was just very different. So that's why I think there's that massive generational gap. And then tying it to that article that I was reading, and to kind of round this all out, because I'm looking at the time, I've talked long enough. Like, this is also a serious issue, that there is a younger generation of Black kids who aren't aware of their own history. I will say, I do think they do want to learn it. And I think, like, for Black millennials, as we're in our 30s, and the vast majority of us are in our 30s, and then the oldest millennials are into their 40s, like, we have to make sure we preserve our own history and culture, and make sure that the younger generation knows about it. Which is actually the spirit of this podcast, Real Sankara Hours, and why we started it, because we believed it's important to have Black-owned media to not only talk about news from an independent Black perspective, but also it's a type of entity where we can preserve our own culture in our own narrative, and so that other people, learn from it. So, and also, I do know that we have non-Black listeners. I do think that this knowledge is important for non-black people as well. So when we put out episodes and like, when I hop on this microphone and say what I have to say, I'm also, especially as a teacher, and I'm thinking about like, yeah, the generation, the generation of black kids growing up today, because I want to make sure that there's resources for them to learn their own culture, where they come from, so that they're not confused and alienated. So anyway, to end on that, and so that's a good way to end this riff. This episode is free, so if you like this episode, for $5 a month, you get access to bonus content. With my solo episodes, I think I might go back and forth between making some free and some bonus. So, but yeah, if you want to support independent black media, and if you believe in like the importance of preserving black history and black knowledge, and the importance of having independent black owned media, to keep this afloat, yeah, become a patron. $5 a month gives you access to bonus episodes, and you can even chip in just a one-time donation. We're not a nonprofit. We are a worker cooperative LLC. So we are a business, but because we are socialists, we believe in workers owning the means of production. So the way we structured it is more of like a cooperative, but it's just me and Peter. So like, anyway, but we do have like our own like internal bylaws, and that's the structure. We're a worker cooperative. So yeah, if you believe in the importance of independent black-owned media and you want to sustain it, hey, keep it afloat by becoming a patron. Patreon.com/Real Sankara Hours. You can subscribe and become a patron. For $5 a month, you get access to bonus episodes. For around like $3 a month, you don't get access, but you keep the podcast afloat. And you can, make any type of like one-time donation that you want to, if, just to show that you want to keep this afloat and believe in the mission of what we're doing. Anyway, with that said, signing out. Keep the faith and stay dangerous. Peace out. Hey everyone, this is Adam again. Guess this riff is gonna be a little longer than I expected, but oh well. This is a brief addendum to this solo episode, because I realized I mentioned the Obama effect on black voters, but I didn't explain what that meant, and I was just going through some polling data on the 2024 election and some stats from black demographics about historical black voting patterns, and I wanted to mention both because I wanted to flesh out what I meant. So basically, so the Obama effect, what I meant by that is the Obama years saw like higher black turnout, and the vast majority of black people voted for Obama for both of his terms. And actually I'm looking at blackdemographics.com. In both 2008 and 2012, Barack Obama got over 90% of the black vote, which the last time, let's see. Okay, so 2000, 90% of black voters voted for the Democratic candidate. That was Al Gore at the time. Bush won that election. But before that, in 1964, 94% of black voters voted for the Democratic candidate. So that was Lyndon Johnson at the time. In 2008, Obama got 95% of the black vote, That's the highest. He got the highest share of black voters in pretty much like black voting history, going back to 1936 at least. And then in 2012, he got 93% of the black vote. In 2016, 88%. So again, these numbers I'm referring to right now are from black demographics. I find black demographics to be, it's very good at just looking at just some good numbers on just some facts about black America. So anyway, in 2016, 88% of black people voted for the Democratic candidate, so Hillary Clinton. In 2020, 92% of black voters voted for Biden. So let's see, gender. I'm also looking at Pew Research. In 2016, it broke it down by. I'm looking at breaking it down by race and gender. So yeah, in 2020, 87% of black men voted for Biden. 95% of black women voted for Biden. In 2024, so Trump did gain with black male voters. So it was basically 75% of black men voted for Harris, and 21% of black men voted for Donald Trump. 89% of black women voted for Harris in 2024, and 10% of black women voted for Donald Trump. Now, what's interesting to note is that, black voters overall still went for Kamala Harris. Among men, black men voted for Kamala Harris at pretty much the highest, right? What's funny is that like there is all this like sort of hemming and hawing about like the prospect of black men like turning the election for Trump. What's funny is that not all it's true. Trump increased his support among black male voters, but he also increased his support among black women voters. So black women actually, this is what's interesting. I'm looking, again, this is Pew Research. Trump got double digits, technically, of black women voters, 10%. So, but and actually among Latinos, it was like almost split down the middle. Like 51% of Latinos voted for Harris, 48% voted for Trump. That's within like the margin of error around there. Then you break it down by gender. Yeah, Latino men went for Trump 50%, while 48% of Latino male voters went for Harris. With Latino women, 52% of Latino women went for Harris. 46% of Latino women went for Trump. That's pretty high. I mean, like, yeah, there are more Latino women who voted for Trump than black men. And I'm looking at even for Asians. Asians, yeah, it was like 57% of Asians went for Harris, 40% went for Trump. And actually, yeah, it's actually like, it's interesting for both Asian men and women, they both 40% for each demographic, Asian men and Asian women. 40% of each of them went for Trump. Asian men, 56% went for Harris, and then 57% of Asian women went for Harris. Yeah, the Latino vote was pretty split. That's interesting. Anyway, so I don't want to harp too much on that, but my point is that I'm going to return back to black demographics, and it looks at the black vote and black party affiliation from 1936 to 2020. And you see like a change in the trajectory, right? Because the Republican Party, obviously that was the party of Abraham Lincoln and the abolition of slavery. So a lot of abolitionists during the time of the Civil War were in the Republican Party. But over time, these parties, they've shifted over time because coalitions change and interests change. So, in 1936, so it breaks it down. So black demographics breaks down the black vote for president and then for party affiliation. Beginning in 1936, 71% of black voters voted for the Democratic candidate, 28% voted for the Republican. Then I'm going to kind of go each election year. So 1940, 67% of black voters went for the Democratic president. 1944, 68% of black voters voted Democrat. 1948, 77% of black voters voted Democrat. In 1952, 76% of black voters voted Democrat. 1956, 61% of black voters voted for Democrat. 68% of black voters in 1960 voted for the Democratic candidate. So 1960, that was JFK, John F. Kennedy. 1964, that's Lyndon Johnson. 94% went for Lyndon Johnson. And then 1968, 85% went for the Democratic candidate. So like from 1968 to 1988, the black vote pretty much stayed at or above 85%. From 1968 to 1988. So from like the late 60s to the late 80s. In 1992, 82% of black voters voted for the Democrats. So that's Bill Clinton at the time. 84% of black voters voted for Clinton in 1996. In 2000, 90% of black voters voted for Al Gore. 2004, 88% of black voters voted for John Kerry. And then you see, the Obama years. 94% in 2008, 93% in 2012 went for Obama. And 2016, 88% went for Hillary Clinton. And then 92% in 2020 went for Joe Biden. So, and also it kind of breaks down. So I had said that like, there's usually around like 20% who vote Republican. So this is part of the reason why I made this addendum, because it kind of fluctuates. So like technically, according to black demographics, starting in 88, black people who voted Republican has usually been around like 10% until like you get to the Obama years where it's like less than 10%. Then there are other black people who voted like independent or other, right? So that's also a factor. Black America's party affiliation, that also changed from 1936 to 2020. So, and actually, so black people registered Republican, 1936, 37% were Republican, and 44% of black people were Democrats in 1936. So you see an interesting split in 1936, because there's still like a cohort of black people voting Republican. In 1936, 28% of black people voted Republican for the Republican candidate. 1940, you see 42% registered Democrat, 42% registered Republican. In 1936, 19% of black voters were independent. 16% of black voters were independent in 1940. And it starts to, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the increase of, in 1948 is when you start to see black people registering as Democrat above 50%, starting in 1948. 1952, that number goes up to 66%. 1952. I want to make sure I said that correctly. Year 1952, 66% registered with the Democratic Party. 1956, 1956. I'm sorry, I've got looking at these wrong. Yeah. Oh my gosh. In 1956, 56% of black people registered Democrat. That's why I got it all messed up. Okay. Yeah. So in 1956, 56% of black voters were registered as Democrats. 1960, 58% registered with the Democratic Party. Then you see the major uptick in 1964 with Lyndon Johnson. But again, even with like the 30s and Roosevelt, you started to see like more black people voting for the Democratic Party for president. But you start to see a change in party affiliation right in 1964. Again, that's a passage of the Civil Rights Act. President Johnson got elected because Johnson, he was president. So JFK was assassinated in 1963. So that means Lyndon Johnson was vice president and he became president at the time. So in 1964, Johnson was running for president. So just want to take a sip. So yeah, you start to see black people voting for the Democratic Party kind of in lockstep beginning in 1964. The move to the Democratic Party started with Roosevelt in the 30s, but you really see the tight relationship between black America and the Democratic Party starting in 1964 with Lyndon Johnson and the signing of the Civil Rights Act, and then the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So 1968, 92% of black people registered with the Democratic Party. 1972, 75% were with the Democratic Party, and 20% were registered as independent. So this is another thing, is that like black politics, what also doesn't get talked about is that there are plenty of black people who are like independent, who are like, are not wedded to either party. I mean, full disclosure, I myself am registered as independent. Basically, no party affiliation. So I'm not a registered Democrat and I'm not a registered Republican. I'm registered as an independent. So basically, non-party affiliated. So there are black people like myself who, when it comes to party affiliation, we don't have any particular party affiliation, or could be registered with like another third party. There's black people who are registered with the Green Party, but anyway, that also plays a factor in terms of looking at these numbers. But 1972, 76, these numbers, like particularly from 1968 and 72, then like 76 up until like 2000, they pretty much stay above 75% registered with the Democratic Party, and then those registered as Republican, starting in 1964, have tended to be between like 3% to 9%. What's interesting, in 2004, there are 15% in 2004 who were registered as Republicans among black voters. And then even in 2008, you see 20% of black people are registered independent, and then 5% registered Republican, 76% are registered Democrat. So that means there are black voters who, let's say if they're independent, right? They may not be affiliated with the Democratic Party, but they'll vote Democrat when it comes to president or, like elections, local, state elections, stuff like that. So my point is that, looking at these numbers, that's why I say like the voting patterns of black people has typically been like around sort of like 80-20. You can maybe even say like a 75-25% breakdown if you want to be a little generous. But like for the most part, when it comes to black voting patterns, especially when it comes to the presidency, it's usually been around like 80%. And then there's always been, again, a cohort of black people who vote Republican. yeah, even like black people who voted Republican, like it's been double digits voting, like at least, for example, 1968, 15% of black people voted for the Republicans. 1986, 12% of black voters voted Republican. 2004, 11% black voters voted Republican. 1976, sorry, 1976, 15% black voters voted Republican. So like, there's always been a cohort of black voters who are Republican or vote conservative, and then like you could even include like black people who are, let's say they're independent, but like some of their politics could lean like somewhat right of center. An example I would point up is someone like John McWhorter or even Glenn Loury, right? They're both black conservatives, but they're kind of like quote unquote independent or something like that, independent and et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to say that, mention that. And like I said, I think the Obama effect, like the love affair that black America had with Obama, I think that has waned. And I think that's important to consider when we look at black voting patterns, especially when it comes to Trump, because like my interpretation is that I would say like there's always been a cohort of black people who just have conservative to right of center beliefs, and then black people who are just independent. And I think when it comes to these numbers, Trump has been able to appeal to that crowd. Like, let's say, like, let me put it this way. He's appealing to a new generation of black people whose politics are like right of center. So, but I do think that the love affair and that close relationship between black America and the Democratic Party, I think that's waning. I think it's weakening. That doesn't mean that black people are going to vote Republican. I really think just like a lot of black Americans are reassessing, like, why the hell are we voting for the Democratic Party? Because again, like really the last time black America got anything substantive from the Democratic Party was in the 60s. Since then, black America has been perhaps the most loyal racial ethnic bloc for the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party has not returned that favor. So I think more black Americans are reassessing that. And I think that's played a role. I think that played a role to some extent with the 2024 election. Like, I really don't think that like the black people who voted for Trump, I don't think that their votes really mattered as much. Looking at, honestly, the race and gender breakdown, like, I'm even kind of surprised. Like, the Latino vote is almost split down the middle, which is unusual because, okay, let's compare Latino voters to 2016 and 2020. In 2016, 66% of Latinos voted for Clinton. And in 2020, 61% of Latinos voted for Biden over Trump. So the Latino vote, you know, at least in the prior elections, 2016 and 2020, has been like around, let's say, like 65 35 or 65-35, kind of rough breakdown if you want to like be like kind of imagine it that way, right? Now it's like split down the middle. So that's something I'm kind of shocks me, because I know a lot of people are talking about like like the Latinos for Trump, and now it sucks because they're in for a rude awakening, but then a lot of people are like, hey, you fucking voted for this. But yeah, those numbers, the Latino vote is like pretty staggering. Like, that's like, yeah, it's almost split down the middle. So I think that had a role to play in Trump's victory. Actually, you know what? I'll end this addendum on this because I wanted to bring it up. There's this really interesting article in NPR. The headline is Trump still would have won in 2024 even if everyone had turned out to vote. Pew Research finds. So basically, well, it said 64% of the eligible voting population turned out in 2024, so the second highest since 1904. So turnout was actually pretty good, but it says it even if, I'm quoting from the article, even if everyone who was eligible to vote in the country would have voted, President Trump still would have won the 2024 presidential election. So Trump won in 2024 with, just under 50% of the vote. So it was 49.7% went for Trump, while 48.2% went for Kamala Harris. Yeah, that was like incredibly fucking close. But if everyone who could vote did, according to this article, Trump would have won by an even wider margin. 48% to 45%, which it is true. Yeah, I think the Trump coalition did grow more ethnically diverse, and I think honestly that has to do with the increase in support he got from Latino voters. Not all of it, but according to the numbers, like the fact that the Latino vote was like damn near split down the middle, I think Trump being able to pick off more Latino voters is part of that. So, and yeah, the sort of like Trump movement, at least in the 2024 election, has gotten more ethnically and racially diverse. And I think it's just because of the message he was saying about like cracking down on quote unquote illegal immigration and tackling inflation. And yeah, I think that appealed to like, people who are not white males. It appealed to like, other non-white people, particularly Latinos. Even though Latino technically that's not a race, but I think like in the context of the U.S., I could save that for another discussion about like the history of slavery and racism in Latin America. But I think like when people refer to Latinos, the default Latino that people are referring to are mestizos, people who are half indigenous, half Spanish. So technically like, yeah. So anyway, that's it. I just wanted to clarify what I meant by the Obama effect and even mention those numbers. This addendum went a little longer than I expected, but oh well, that's part of the spirit of Adam's Riffs, because I can go on and on. But anyway, yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this solo episode. Again, keep the faith and stay dangerous. Peace out.